I was fired in the middle of an executive meeting for being too slow with procedures. They didn't know I had locked every federal contract with a signature only I could provide. And now, good luck explaining yourself to the Department of Justice. Ethan. My name is Rachel Vance. For 8 years, I built the compliance infrastructure at Duratech Systems from nothing. I created systems that protected the company, our government clients, and ultimately the public. I took pride in my work, even when others saw it as an obstacle to their ambitions, especially when they did. The sleek conference room felt unusually cold that Tuesday morning. 12 pairs of eyes avoided mine as I took my seat at the glossy mahogany table. Everyone except Ethan Rowe, our newly appointed CEO, who stared directly at me with the practiced intensity of someone who believed eye contact was a weapon. At 36, Ethan was the youngest executive in the room by at least a decade, with slicked-back dark hair and the perpetual smirk of someone who'd never been told no. "Let's get straight to the point," Ethan began, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. "We need to talk about our growth constraints." I knew immediately what was coming. For 3 months since his appointment, Ethan had been systematically dismantling what he called bureaucratic bottlenecks across the company. My department compliance was the ultimate bottleneck in his eyes. "Rachel," he continued, leaning forward, "your department has delayed 4 major contracts this quarter alone. The Pentagon deal was held up for 2 weeks because of what you called supplier verification issues." "Those weren't just issues, Ethan," I replied, keeping my voice steady. 3 of their components failed our security protocols. They were Chinese manufactured. "And you cost us time we didn't have," he cut in. "While you were running checks, North Star closed a similar deal with the Air Force." Marcus Chen, our CFO, shifted uncomfortably beside me. He'd been with Duratech longer than anyone else in the room, had seen us grow from a scrappy defense contractor with 2 clients to a rising star with over $200 million in annual contracts. "Rachel's process caught a serious compliance issue," Marcus said quietly. "If those components had gone into production—" "But they didn't," Ethan interrupted again, "and we still lost the contract timeline. This is exactly what I'm talking about." He looked around the room, gathering support. "We're moving too slowly in an industry that rewards speed. Our competitors are eating our lunch because they're not bogged down in endless verification loops." I felt my face flush. Those endless loops are federal requirements. They exist to prevent exactly the kind of shortcuts that land companies in front of congressional hearings. Ethan's smile tightened, which brings me to today's announcement. As part of our organizational restructuring, we're streamlining the compliance function. Effective immediately, compliance will be integrated into each division rather than operating as a standalone department. The room went silent. I stared at him, processing what he was really saying. "You're eliminating my position," I stated flatly. "We're evolving beyond it," he corrected, as if the semantics made a difference. "Division heads will now oversee their own compliance protocols. It's more efficient, more responsive to business needs." "It's a direct violation of federal contracting requirements," I countered. "Defense contractors our size are required to maintain independent compliance oversight." "We've consulted with legal on this," Ethan said dismissively. "There are interpretations that allow for our new structure." I glanced at Diane Harper, our general counsel, who suddenly became very interested in her tablet. She wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know. Whatever interpretation they'd concocted wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny. "So I'm being terminated," I said, making it clear. "Your role is being eliminated," Ethan corrected again. "HR has prepared a separation package, 6 months' salary, extended benefits. It's generous." I looked around the table, at colleagues I'd worked alongside for years. Most still wouldn't meet my gaze. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. "When did the board approve this?" I asked. Ethan's smile didn't waver. "The board has given me full authority to implement operational changes. They're fully supportive of creating a more agile organization." Translation. The board hadn't explicitly approved this specific change. Ethan was exploiting the broad mandate they'd given him to transform the company. "I see," I said, standing up. "Then I'll need the termination in writing, along with formal acknowledgement that you're assuming all compliance responsibilities previously under my purview." "HR will handle the paperwork," Ethan replied smoothly. "You can clean out your office this afternoon. It will need your laptop and access card before you leave." I looked him directly in the eye. "And the federal certification signatures, the ones tied to my credentials." For the briefest moment, Ethan's confidence flickered, then it returned, stronger than before. "Jason can handle those temporarily until we update the systems." Jason Dorr, my second in command, looked up with surprise. Clearly, he hadn't been consulted about his new responsibilities. I simply nodded, gathered my tablet, and walked out of the conference room with as much dignity as I could muster. No tears, no pleading, no scene. That's not who I was. That's not who I'd ever been. As the door closed behind me, I heard Ethan's voice resume, "Now, let's talk about the Artemis contract opportunities." Just like that, 8 years of building Duratec's compliance infrastructure was deemed unnecessary. 8 years of late nights, missed weekends, and meticulous work to ensure that every contract, every product, every decision met the exacting standards required by federal law, all discarded because a new CEO thought compliance was just red tape. What Ethan didn't understand, what he hadn't bothered to learn, was that my systems weren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They were protections. And one of those protections was about to become very, very relevant. I walked to my office, a modest space with glass walls that I'd insisted on years ago as a symbol of transparency. Inside, I didn't immediately start packing. Instead, I sat at my computer and pulled up a specific set of files, the authentication protocols I'd built for our federal contracts. 2 years earlier, when we'd secured our first Department of Defense contract exceeding $50 million, I'd implemented a multi-layered authentication system for contract approvals. The system required biometric verification, secure token authentication, and encrypted signatures that couldn't be delegated or overridden without proper documentation. It was state-of-the-art, exceeding federal requirements. But 6 months ago, when Ethan first joined as COO before his rapid promotion to CEO, he'd pushed for a more streamlined approval process. He wanted an AI-based system that could accelerate contract processing. "Every day a contract sits in approval is money we're not making," he'd argued in one of our first contentious meetings. I'd agreed to implement the new system with one critical modification that I'd described as required under defense contracting standards. I'd coded a Level 1 authentication layer that required my specific credentials for final authorization on all federal contracts. The system was designed so that these credentials couldn't be easily transferred or bypassed. I documented this feature thoroughly, though in technical language that most executives wouldn't bother to read closely. It wasn't sabotage. It was a safeguard ensuring that someone with compliance expertise would always need to review critical contracts before they were finalized. Many defense contractors had similar systems, but I'd made ours particularly robust. And now, as I sat in my soon-to-be former office, I realized that Ethan had just created a serious problem for himself, without my credentials. Duratec couldn't properly authenticate new federal contracts or modifications to existing ones. Jason didn't have the necessary clearance level or authentication credentials, despite what Ethan had claimed in the meeting. I could, of course, help them transition. I could document the process, transfer my credentials, train someone else. That would be the professional thing to do. But as I looked out through my glass walls at the office that had just discarded me like an obsolete piece of equipment, I made a decision. I wouldn't sabotage anything. I would simply let my carefully built systems work exactly as designed. If Ethan wanted to eliminate proper compliance oversight, he would discover exactly why those systems existed in the first place. I spent the next 3 hours methodically backing up my personal files and clearing out my office. I took only what was truly mine: a few books, photos, my certification diplomas, and a small notebook containing my personal notes from 8 years of building compliance systems. Everything else, all the work files, documentation, and company property, I left meticulously organized. By 4 o'clock, my office was empty except for the furniture and company equipment. I placed my access card and company phone on the desk, took one last look around, and walked out. Linda from HR met me at the elevator, looking uncomfortable. "Rachel, I'm so sorry about this. I was only told this morning." "It's not your fault, Linda," I said, giving her a small smile. "These things happen." "I have your separation papers," she said, handing me a folder, "and information about the continuation of benefits. The package is actually quite good." I nodded, taking the folder without opening it. Thanks, I appreciate it. Will you be okay? She asked, genuine concern in her voice. I will be, I assured her. Tell me, was anyone else let go today? Linda hesitated. Not today, but there are rumors of more restructuring coming. I wasn't surprised. Ethan's type always started with a few strategic eliminations before wider cuts. Take care of yourself, Linda, I said, stepping into the elevator. Update your resume, just in case. As the doors closed, I saw her troubled expression. She knew I was right. The drive home felt surreal. For 8 years, I defined myself largely through my work at Duratech. I'd been proud of what I'd built, of the integrity I'd maintained even when pressured to cut corners. Now I was, unemployed at 42, a compliance expert without a company to keep compliant. My condo felt emptier than usual that evening. I poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet and sat on my balcony overlooking the river. Spring was just beginning to hint at its arrival, with the faintest green buds appearing on the trees below. I should have been angry. I should have been plotting revenge or at least a scathing Glassdoor review. Instead, I felt an odd sense of calm. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was the knowledge that I'd built something that couldn't be so easily dismantled, not without consequences. I opened my personal laptop and updated my LinkedIn profile to reflect my new employment status. Within an hour, I had messages from 3 recruiters and 2 former colleagues expressing surprise and offering connections. The industry was always hungry for experienced compliance professionals, especially those with defense contracting expertise. But I didn't immediately respond to any of them. Instead, I sat with my wine and watched the lights come on across the river as dusk settled. For the first time in years, I had no urgent emails to answer, no compliance issues to resolve, no early meeting to prepare for. The sensation was foreign, almost uncomfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, our CFO. This wasn't right. Call if you need anything. I appreciated the gesture, though I noticed he hadn't spoken up during the meeting. Few people were willing to risk their own positions, even when they knew something was wrong. I couldn't entirely blame him. I texted back a simple thanks, and then set my phone aside. Tomorrow, I would start planning my next steps. Tonight, I would simply be still. The next few weeks passed in a blur of job applications, networking calls, and unexpected domestic projects. I repainted my kitchen, something I'd been meaning to do for 2 years but never found the time. I joined a morning yoga class. I had lunch with friends I'd neglected during my all-consuming work at Duratech. I also began consulting with a labor attorney about my termination. While Virginia's employment at will laws gave Ethan broad latitude to eliminate positions, there were still questions about whether proper procedures had been followed, especially given my role in federal compliance. They should have had a transition plan for your compliance responsibilities, my attorney, Grace Kim, pointed out during our second meeting. Especially with active federal contracts, did they ask you to transfer any of your authentication credentials? No, I replied. There was no transition plan, no knowledge transfer, nothing. Grace made a note. That's unusual and potentially problematic for them. What happens to contract approvals without your credentials? I explained the authentication system I'd built, including the Level 1 verification that required my specific credentials. Grace looked up from her notes with raised eyebrows. So they can't properly authenticate new federal contracts without you. They can process most internal approvals, but final submission to federal systems requires Level 1 authentication. I confirmed. They'd either need my credentials or need to rebuild the entire authentication system, which would require notifying their federal contracting officers of the change. And did anyone follow up with you about this after your termination? Not a word, I said, which suggests either they haven't tried to process any new federal contracts yet, or they're trying to find a workaround, Grace finished for me, potentially bypassing required federal authentication protocols. I nodded, which would be a significant compliance violation. Grace sat back in her chair, thinking. Let's wait and see what happens. If they contact you about the authentication system, we'll know they're trying to do things properly. If they don't, they might be creating a much bigger problem for themselves, I concluded. In the meantime, I accepted a part-time position at the local library. The pay was a fraction of what I'd earned at Duratech, but the separation package meant I wasn't in immediate financial danger. The library job gave me structure and a reason to get dressed in the morning. Shelving books and helping patrons with research questions was soothing in its simplicity after years of navigating complex compliance regulations. It was during my third week at the library that I received a LinkedIn message from Jason Dorr, my former deputy at Duratech. Hope you're doing well. Rachel, quick question. Do you remember the authentication system for federal contracts? Is there any way to see who's actually approving contracts in the system, getting some weird errors? Miss your expertise around here. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Hi, Jason. The system logs all authentication attempts in the secure audit database. You should be able to access those logs with your admin credentials. What kind of errors are you seeing? His reply came quickly. System keeps rejecting final approvals. Says the credentials don't match required level 1 authentication. Ethan's getting frustrated because we can't push contracts through to the DoD portal. So there it was. They'd discovered the authentication barrier and were trying to find a way around it. I felt a small, vindictive thrill at the thought of Ethan facing this unexpected obstacle. That's the security protocol working as designed, I wrote back. Level 1 authentication requires specific credentials that were tied to the compliance officer role. It was all documented in the system specifications that were filed with the DoD. Any way to override it, Jason asked. Not without notifying the federal contracting officers and getting their approval for a system modification, I replied truthfully. It's a security feature, not a bug. Jason didn't respond immediately. I imagined him having to deliver this news to Ethan, explaining that the compliance system I'd built couldn't simply be bypassed. 3 days later, I received another message, this time from Marcus Chen. Rachel, we need to talk. Ethan tried to push through contract modifications without proper authentication. Now we're getting questions from the Pentagon about irregular approval patterns. Can you call me? I didn't call immediately. Instead, I consulted with Grace first. This is exactly what we anticipated, she said. They're discovering that they can't just eliminate a key compliance function without consequences. What do you want to do? I'm not sure, I admitted. Part of me wants to let them figure it out themselves. That's certainly an option, Grace acknowledged. You have no obligation to help them solve a problem they created, but it might be worth hearing what they're offering. I called Marcus that evening from my balcony, watching the sunset as I dialed. Rachel, thanks for calling back, he said, sounding relieved. We've got a situation here. So I gathered from your message, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. What's happening? Marcus sighed heavily. Ethan tried to approve modifications to the Hermes contract last week. The system rejected his credentials. He had IT try to override it, but that triggered some kind of security alert to the DoD portal. I nodded to myself. The system was working exactly as designed. Any attempt to force authentication would trigger alerts to both our internal security logs and to the federal contracting system. Now we've got someone from the Inspector General's office asking why we're trying to push through contract modifications without proper security protocols. Marcus continued. Ethan's saying it's just a technical glitch, but they're not buying it. It's not a glitch, I said calmly. It's a security feature that was fully documented and approved as part of our federal contracting compliance. Rachel, Marcus said, his voice lowering. He wants to know if you sabotaged the system before you left. I felt a flash of anger. I did nothing of the sort. Every aspect of that system was properly documented and implemented with full transparency. The authentication requirements were explicitly outlined in our compliance filings with the DoD. Ethan eliminated the position that held the necessary credentials without proper transition. That's not sabotage. That's his failure to understand basic compliance requirements. There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. I believe you, and I think I can convince the board of that, but we need to fix this. The Pentagon contract is worth $24 million, and right now it's in limbo. What exactly are you asking me to do, Marcus? We need you to help transition your authentication credentials, or at least explain how to reset the system properly. That would require me to come in as a consultant, with a proper contract and appropriate compensation, I said firmly. And I'd need assurances that everything would be done by the book. I can make that happen, Marcus said quickly, too quickly. Ethan won't like it, but the board will override him if it means saving the Pentagon contract. I'll think about it, I replied, not committing. Send me a formal consulting proposal, and I'll review it with my attorney. After we hung up, I sat watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted to help fix the situation after all. I'd built those systems to protect Duratech, not to harm it. But another part of me felt a grim satisfaction that Ethan was facing the consequences of his arrogant dismissal of compliance requirements. The next morning, I received 2 more messages that changed everything. The first was from an unfamiliar email address with a gov domain. Ms. Vance, my name is Special Agent Thomas Reeves, with the Office of the Inspector General. We're conducting an inquiry into potential contracting irregularities at Duratech Systems and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. The second was a news alert I'd set up for Duratech. Defense contractor Duratech under federal scrutiny for possible contract fraud. The article was brief, but devastating. Federal investigators were looking into allegations that Duratech had attempted to circumvent security protocols on defense contracts. The company's stock had dropped 18% on the news. I called Grace immediately. I just saw the news, she said before I could speak. And I'm guessing the feds have reached out to you. Yes. The Inspector General's office wants to talk. This changes things, Grace said thoughtfully. You need to cooperate fully. But we also need to protect you. They might try to argue that your authentication system was unreasonably restrictive. It wasn't, I insisted. It met industry standards and was fully documented. I believe you, Grace assured me. But we need to be prepared. I want to be present for any discussions with federal investigators. We arranged to meet the following day to prepare for the interview with Special Agent Reeves. In the meantime, I received the consulting proposal from Marcus. The terms were generous, almost suspiciously so. They were offering $50,000 for what would likely be less than a week's work to help transition the authentication system. It felt like a bribe, or at least an attempt to buy my silence with federal investigators. I forwarded it to Grace without responding to Marcus. Grace's assessment was blunt. They're panicking. They've realized they have a serious problem and they're trying to fix it before the feds dig too deeply. But notice they're not offering to reinstate your position just to pay you to help them out of the mess they created. Should I accept? I asked. Not yet, Grace advised. Let's talk to the Inspector General first. Understand what they're investigating before you agree to help Duratech. You don't want to inadvertently become part of a cover-up. The meeting with Special Agent Reeves took place at Grace's office the next afternoon. Reeves was a serious, methodical man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the careful speech patterns of someone who measured every word. Ms. Vance, we're looking into some irregularities with contract approvals at Duratech Systems, he began after introductions were complete. Specifically, attempts to modify the authentication protocols on several federal contracts without proper notification or approval. I nodded. I built those authentication systems during my tenure as compliance officer. Can you explain how they work? Reeves asked. For the next hour, I walked him through the multi-layered authentication system I'd designed, explaining each security feature and why it was implemented. I showed him the documentation I'd created, including the specifications that had been filed with federal contracting officers. So this Level 1 authentication requirement, it was tied specifically to your credentials as compliance officer, Reeves clarified. Yes, but not to me personally, I explained. It was tied to the role. Anyone properly appointed to that position and granted the appropriate security clearances could hold those credentials. But the system required that someone in a compliance oversight role review and approve all federal contracts. And when you were terminated, there was no transition of those credentials, I said. No discussion of how to maintain compliance with federal contracting requirements without the compliance officer role. Reeves made notes before asking his next question. In your opinion, was this an oversight or deliberate? Grace interjected. That calls for speculation. Let me rephrase, Reeves said smoothly. Based on your experience, what would the standard procedure be for transitioning such critical credentials when eliminating a position like yours? Standard procedure would require a formal transition plan, I answered. Documentation of all credentials and authentication requirements. Transfer of those credentials to another authorized individual. and notification to federal contracting officers of the change in compliance oversight. And none of that happened in your case. No, I was informed that my position was eliminated, effective immediately. There was no discussion of transition, credential transfer, or compliance continuity. Reeves nodded, making more notes. We've received information that since your departure, there have been attempts to bypass the authentication requirements you implemented. Are you aware of this? I've been contacted by former colleagues who mentioned difficulties with the authentication system. I acknowledged. I informed them that the system was working as designed and could not be bypassed without proper authorization from federal contracting officers. Did anyone ask you to help them bypass those requirements? They asked if there was a way to override the authentication, I said carefully. I explained that there wasn't not without proper notification and approval processes. Reeves looked up from his notes. Ms. Vance, are you aware that Duratech submitted contract modifications to the Department of Defense last week with what appears to be your authentication credentials, despite the fact that you no longer work there? I felt a cold shock run through me. That's impossible. My credentials couldn't be used without my biometric verification. That's what we thought, Reeves said grimly, which suggests someone attempted to falsify your credentials. Grace leaned forward. Agent Reeves, are you suggesting that Duratech attempted to commit fraud on federal contracts? We're still investigating, Reeves replied diplomatically, but the evidence suggests that someone at Duratech attempted to use Ms. Vance's credentials without authorization to approve contract modifications worth approximately $24 million. I sat back, stunned. This was far worse than I had imagined. Ethan hadn't just tried to bypass the system, he'd potentially attempted to forge my credentials. There's one more thing you should know, Reeves continued. We've been informed that Duratech is currently attempting to hire you as a consultant to, quote, fix authentication issues. Are you planning to accept that offer? I glanced at Grace, who gave me a subtle nod. They've made an offer, I confirmed. I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to understand the situation better first. I would encourage you to be very cautious about any such arrangement, Reeves said. Our investigation is ongoing, and there could be complications if you were to help modify evidence that might be relevant to that investigation. My client has no intention of participating in any improper activities, Grace assured him. If she does consider Duratech's consulting offer, it would be with full transparency to your office. Reeves seemed satisfied with that answer. We may need to speak with you again as our investigation proceeds. In the meantime, I'd ask that you maintain copies of all communications from Duratech personnel regarding their authentication systems. After Reeves left, Grace and I sat in silence for a long moment. This is much bigger than a wrongful termination case now, Grace finally said. They're potentially looking at federal fraud charges. I never imagined Ethan would go that far, I admitted. Trying to forge credentials for federal contracts it's criminal. And desperate, Grace added, which suggests they're under more pressure than we realized. I thought about that on my drive home. What would make Ethan desperate enough to risk federal fraud charges? The Pentagon contract was valuable, certainly, but not worth criminal exposure, unless there was something else, something I didn't know about. When I got home, I had 3 missed calls from Marcus and a text that simply read, Urgent. Please call. It's worse than you think. I didn't call him back immediately. Instead, I opened my laptop and began searching for recent news about Duratech that I might have missed. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A business journal had reported 3 days earlier that Duratech was in advanced talks with Meridian Defense, a larger competitor, about a potential acquisition. The deal would reportedly value Duratech at nearly $1 billion, but was contingent on Duratech meeting certain performance metrics on its government contracts. Suddenly, Ethan's desperation made sense. If the Pentagon contract was delayed or threatened because of authentication issues, the Meridian acquisition could fall through, and Ethan, who had likely negotiated himself a generous change of control package, stood to lose millions personally. I called Grace back. I think I know why they tried to forge my credentials, I told her, explaining about the Meridian acquisition. That would certainly explain the urgency, Grace agreed. But it doesn't excuse criminal behavior. What should I do about Marcus? I asked. He seems genuinely concerned. Call him back, Grace advised, but record the conversation And don't agree to anything. Just listen to what he has to say. Marcus answered on the first ring. Rachel, thank God. We need your help. What's going on? Marcus, I asked, keeping my tone neutral. It's bad, he said, his voice strained. The DoD has suspended all contract activities pending their investigation. The Meridian deal is hanging by a thread, and now the FBI is involved. The FBI? That was new information. They're investigating possible fraud related to federal contracting, Marcus confirmed. They've already interviewed several people in IT and finance. What does Ethan say about all this? Marcus's bitter laugh told me everything. Ethan is claiming he had no knowledge of any attempt to use your credentials. He's saying it must have misunderstood his instructions or acted on their own initiative. That's convenient, I remarked. Rachel, the board is meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation. I've convinced them that they need your help to resolve this cleanly. They're prepared to offer you full reinstatement as compliance officer, with increased authority and a significant raise. I hadn't expected that. Reinstatement after Ethan eliminated the position. Ethan's position is precarious right now, Marcus said carefully. The board has serious concerns about his judgment. Your return would be a strong signal to federal investigators that we're committed to proper compliance. And the authentication issues. We need you to help restore proper protocols and explain to investigators that this was all an unfortunate misunderstanding, a technical issue during transition, not an attempt at fraud. And there it was. They wanted me to help provide cover for what was looking increasingly like deliberate fraud. Marcus, I've already spoken with the Inspector General's office, I said. I can't and won't mischaracterize what happened. There was a long silence before Marcus spoke again. Rachel, a lot of good people at Duratech could lose their jobs if this goes badly. The company might not survive. Is that really what you want? It was a manipulation tactic, but I understood the real concern behind it. Duratech employed over 300 people, most of whom had nothing to do with Ethan's decisions. What I want is for Duratech to operate with integrity, I replied. I'll consider the reinstatement offer, but only if it comes with a genuine commitment to proper compliance, not just as a show for investigators. I'll take that to the board, Marcus promised. Just don't make any decisions until we've had a chance to talk further. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony again, watching the river flow below as dusk settled. The situation had escalated far beyond what I'd anticipated when I'd built those authentication safeguards into our systems. I'd designed them to prevent mistakes, to ensure proper oversight of federal contracts. I hadn't expected them to expose potential fraud. The next morning, I received another call, this time from Diane Harper, Duratech's general counsel. Rachel, we need to meet, she said without preamble. The situation has escalated, and the board wants to discuss options with you directly. I've already told Marcus I'll consider reinstatement only if there's genuine commitment to compliance, I replied. This isn't just about reinstatement anymore, Diane said, her voice tense. Federal investigators are alleging that Ethan directed IT staff to forge your authentication credentials. There's talk of criminal charges. The board needs to understand exactly what happened with your authentication system and what our exposure might be. The mention of criminal charges changed the equation significantly. If federal prosecutors were building a case against Ethan and potentially against Duratech itself, my cooperation could be crucial for the company's survival. I'll meet with the board, I agreed, but I want my attorney present, and I need full transparency about what's already been disclosed to investigators. That's fair, Diane conceded. The board is meeting at 4 this afternoon. Can you make that? I checked with Grace, who rearranged her schedule to accompany me. 4 hours later, we were seated in Duratech's main boardroom, the same room where I'd been informed of my termination just weeks earlier. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Instead of Ethan's confident smirk, I faced 7 grim-faced board members, along with Diane and Marcus. Ethan was conspicuously absent. Walter Simmons, the board chair, began the meeting. Ms. Vance, thank you for coming. We find ourselves in a deeply troubling situation, and we're hoping you can help us understand exactly what has happened. I'll help however I can, I replied. But I want to be clear that my priority is ensuring full compliance with all legal and regulatory requirements. Walter nodded. That's precisely what we need right now. Could you explain to the board exactly how the authentication system you implemented works and what may have gone wrong after your departure? For the next 30 minutes, I walked the board through the authentication system again, explaining the technical details in terms they could understand. I described how the Level 1 authentication requirement was tied to the compliance officer role and couldn't be easily bypassed or transferred without proper documentation and notification. And in your professional opinion, Walter asked when I finished, was it possible that someone could have mistakenly attempted to use your credentials without understanding the implications? Grace interjected before I could answer. My client cannot speculate about others' intentions or knowledge. Let me ask differently, Walter amended. Would a person with basic understanding of federal contracting requirements reasonably know that using someone else's authentication credentials would be improper? Yes, I said firmly. Using someone else's credentials to authenticate federal contracts would be widely understood to be improper and potentially fraudulent. The board members exchanged glances. Marcus looked down at his tablet, his expression troubled. Ms. Vance, Walter continued, we've received information that suggests Mr. Rowe specifically directed IT staff to find a way to use your credentials after you left the company. Were you aware of this? No, I said honestly. I was only contacted about difficulties with the authentication system, not about specific attempts to use my credentials. Walter nodded grimly. The board has suspended Mr. Rowe pending the outcome of the federal investigation. We're cooperating fully with investigators, and we would like to formally offer you reinstatement as Chief Compliance Officer, with expanded authority and a direct reporting line to the board. I glanced at Grace, who gave me the slightest nod. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I would need certain assurances before I could consider returning. Such as, Walter prompted, complete autonomy for the compliance department, adequate staffing and resources, a seat on the executive committee, and most importantly, a clear commitment from the board that compliance will never again be sacrificed for speed or convenience. Walter didn't hesitate. Those terms are acceptable. We've learned a difficult lesson about the importance of proper compliance oversight. The board is committed to ensuring it remains a priority going forward. I still wasn't entirely convinced. What about the Meridian acquisition? My understanding is that